Is Islam a threat? No more than any mainstream religion is a threat. No more than Christianity is a threat, no more than Judaism is a threat. I'll unpack this in a second. But are religious extremists a threat? Yes, religious extremists who legitimate and mobilize by appealing to religion in what I call their unholy wars. Religious extremists who just don't use but abuse their religion. Now, why does this issue matter? Well, obviously, we can talk about the impact of 9/11. We can talk about the impact in London, the so-called 7/7 bombings. We can talk about the threat of global terrorism. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. But let me try to put something in perspective for you. Most terrorism experts would tell you that the number of terrorists are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1%. Okay? So despite what President Bush during his administration and Mr. Cheney wanted to do every time they wanted to be elected, it's not that there isn't a global terrorist threat, i.e. that there isn't terrorism can't strike globally. But what makes it such a difficult thing to deal with is the fact that today you can terrorize with only a small group of people, as we saw with 9/11, and in very innovative ways. It's not a matter of talking about conventional armed warfare. That's why so much of what people talk about is asymmetric warfare. So we want to keep the proportion of this in place, because that has to do with the whole question of why brushstroke 1.5 billion Muslims, because of what a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of people in their faith do. That's like brushstroking Catholicism because of everything from the Crusades to the problems of pedophilia, and saying, well, that's what Catholics are about. There are a lot of things that one could do if we wanted to bash Catholics tonight, but I don't have time to do that. I come from the tradition and I have a right to do that. Let me tell you something autobiographical about myself, simply because of what I'm going to be talking about. And I was really not that much autobiographical until after 9/11. I am married 45 years. I'm Italian-American, born in Brooklyn. Before that, not before I was born, I always say in another life, but it was after I was born, I was in a monastery for 10 years, a Catholic monastery. I also, in addition to having degrees in theology, did significant work. My minor for my doctorate was in Hinduism and Buddhism. The reason I tell you that is I'm going to be making some comparative comments about religion. And indeed, I've been a co-author of a number of books on world religions with Oxford. So I just want you to know that I'm just not kind of trying to bull my way through this when I make comparative examples. What I'm going to try to do is lay out where I'm coming from on this topic and why I think it's important, and then allow enough time for questions and answers. Because the problem you have when you're a speaker is that you can never psych out what a particular audience has by way of questions. And if you don't allow enough time for questions, people always get up and say, in your talk you didn't refer to X, even though the title of your talk wouldn't mean that you should be referring to X at all. But they'll get up and say, I noticed you didn't refer to Bosnia. Was there a reason for that? So you want to leave some space here. But why is the question of is Islam a threat of global significance today? Not just because we talk about global terrorism, but because the two largest religions in the world are Christianity and Islam. There are 1.5 billion Muslims who are an integral part now of the global mosaic. And they're not just out there in 57 Muslim countries, as they were when I first studied Islam 30 or 40 years ago. They are now here in the West. Islam is the second or third largest religion in Europe and America. At the same time, it encounters Christianity. Christianity has about, and the statistics here vary, 2.2 billion. But there are more Muslims than there are, for example, Roman Catholics in the world. There are more Muslims in America than there are Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and a slew of others combined. There are also more Catholics than they are those WASPs too, which I'm very happy to report tonight, having had to grow up in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant world. It's a charm. Okay, now, 9/11, though, signaled a major transformation in global history, affecting Muslim-West relations politically, economically, and religiously. And if you really think about it, you have this action Okay? This action which stunned the world, a tragedy that was horrific, but by many world standards in terms of slaughter and wars, etc., that have been going on, Rwanda, Cambodia, etc., you know, you're talking 3,000 Americans killed. Horrendous, but there are lots of reasons why that was very, very traumatic, given, and had the global implications that it had, given the status of the U.S., given the fact that, you know, the symbols that were attacked, etc. One could then mount the kind of global response that in fact occurred, because you could bring together the Bush-Blair administrations that then attempted to lead this armada. But the attacks, many would argue that in fact in many ways bin Laden and the terrorists were fairly successful. They affected our economy, they affected our politics for God knows how many years, they affected our national debt. I mean, you could just go through the whole thing, and they terrorized. And indeed, they terrorized beyond any proportions to which they should have terrorized. That is, we overreacted without keeping in perspective the degree of what we were doing, and we immediately declared a war on global terrorism, we meaning the United States, with Mr. Blair going along with it, but the rest of the world not buying into it, Europe and much of the rest of the world. And in reaction, what did they set up that played into what they wanted? It set up a reaction in the Muslim world that the war against global terrorists was in fact a war against Islam in the Muslim world. So in some ways, the terrorists managed to manipulate things to get what they wanted. They could sit back and say, look at how terrorized Americans are. You know, look at our airports, look at the alerts all the time, and look at very often how the alerts were exaggerated. I mean, it's good to see now, it's almost always an orange alert, but you remember, those of you that are young enough to remember, how often we would be getting these incredible alerts and being told, at the time, we can't tell you why, and even after it, we can't tell you why. You know, we raise that alert. Now, why in many parts of the Muslim world has it been seen as a war against Islam in the Muslim world? I tend to be a kind of Gaddafi type, so I have to keep looking at my wristwatch just to apologize. I'm sort of like a cross between Castro and Gaddafi. So I often give talks and tell people, get the coffee, get the food, sit back, put your feet up. We could be here anywhere from 45 minutes to 4 hours. But I'll try to keep this within bounds. Why in the Muslim world was this seen as a war against Islam in the Muslim world? The day after 9/11, I received an email from Egypt. It was from a woman who is an academic, trained not only in Egypt, but also in Europe, well known in America, a Muslim, an Islamic activist, a public intellectual, a media person, on TV, writes both in Egypt and in the Gulf. And she said, and a critic of United States foreign policy often, she said, it's terrible what happened. I hope your family's okay. And understandably, you will want to, America will want to go into Afghanistan after bin Laden. But she said, no, but she said, but we wonder whether this is the beginning or the end. Whether it's the beginning or the end. So I wrote back and said, what do you mean, knowing what she would say? She said, will this become an excuse to attempt, for America to attempt to redraw the map of the Middle East and the Muslim world? In other words, a new excuse for American intervention, a new excuse for American invasion, perhaps, a new excuse for American occupation. What you have to remember also is, and you can go to the internet and check this out, this is the wonderful thing about the internet, many of the people who were involved in the Bush administration were people who 10 years before had put together a project and a program called the New American Century. And if you go there and you look at the game plan for this New American Century, there they were in the Bush administration, and a lot of what they were saying was falling right into place. This was our century to make the world a better place to live in, our century to promote democracy, but obviously a democracy that was acceptable to us. So with regard to Iraq, it had to be the form of government that we wanted. We already knew who it was we wanted to bring in, Mr. Shalaby. With regard to Hamas, we green light for elections, but when we didn't get what we wanted, we could back away from it. But think about what happened. We went into Afghanistan to get bin Laden. We said we weren't